My next guest is raising concern over the sustainability of the current funding model of the National Student Financial Aid, or NSFAS. It got 5 billion rand in 2015, jumping to 31 billion in 2021, which she says is a practice that will in the long term potentially come back to bite us. To explain is Rhodes University Centre for Postgraduate Studies, Professor Sioux McKenna. Prof, good evening to you and welcome to the program. You've been writing about fixing NSFAS for years now. NSFAS, you say, obviously good, but the funding model problematic and creates a range of negative consequences. Just paint a very high-level picture for our viewers.
Thank you. Indeed, it is an obvious good. You know, it provides opportunities for people to access higher education who simply wouldn't be able to do it without NSFAS. So it's really hard to criticize something that is so clearly a good. But in its current model, it's not sustainable. As you say, from 5 billion, we're now looking at 45 billion being spent on NSFAS next year. Bear in mind that 42 billion is going on the block grants to universities next year. That means that more money is going on NSFAS grants to students than is going to all the 26 public universities to run those universities. And inevitably, because the NSFAS funding is coming from the DHET budget, it means that universities have to start making some tough decisions, such as freezing posts and not maintaining buildings and equipments as well as they should.
We'll come back again to the consequence piece, because I'd like for you to really tease that out and give us a sense of what the major impacts are. And in fact, as you write and as you say, will ultimately affect the quality of education that the students at those universities or institutions will be receiving. This practice of the Department of Higher Education and Training taking back interest that some universities are earning on their invested grants is one of a few financial management practices you're writing about that are prejudicing the reinvestment of that money into the institution themselves. And this concerns you greatly, Sioux. Why is it problematic?
Well, we can see that DHET are trying to find money, and during COVID they had to find money to try and cover various costs associated with COVID. But of course, NSFAS before COVID, during COVID, and since has just escalated at a rate that's not sustainable in terms of the number of students that's funded and the amount that they are funded. And so in order to get this extra money, one of the things that's happened of late has been any unspent funds on particular earmarked grants are being pulled back by DHET to reallocate to NSFAS. And in particular, what we've seen this year for the first time is that on particular earmarked grants where the funding's been paid to universities for certain projects and the universities have invested that money, DHET have now asked for the interest on that money to come back into the central DHET pool to be allocated, one presumes, back to NSFAS. Now, the problem with that is it actually echoes the financial management that we had in the historically black universities under apartheid. While historically white universities were allowed to use their money that they got from the state in the ways that they saw fit, they were allowed to invest that money to build up interest for long-term projects and so on. Historically, black universities were forbidden from doing that. They got a specific budget each year and they had to use it within that year in a use it or lose it kind of mentality. They were not allowed to invest that money. Whatever was left at the end of the year got sent back to the central coffers, which meant that you didn't build up any long-term plans. You weren't able to invest your money and use the interest in ways that made sense for the institution. That was very much about the apartheid state's control over those historically black universities and making sure that they were, in fact, not autonomous at all and they didn't get to control their funds. And it led to a lot of problematic fiscal dumping, a lack of long-term planning, a lack of good financial management. And it's now potentially going to become back into play because, as I say, at the end of this year, 2023, we saw a desperate bid to get interest back on just one or two earmarked grants. The worry is that this will now become more widespread with all the negative consequences that come with that.
Well, what about people who might argue and say, well, you know, some of that money, much of that money is earned back by the university through fees?
Yeah, that's a good point, because NSFAS students are obviously paying fees. And so universities will get some NSFAS funding, as they would from any students that were not NSFAS. They would also be getting the fees. But the issue is that the amount of NSFAS funding that's paid is far more than fees. It covers accommodation, books, general living expenses, which is, again, you can't argue against that. What's the point of giving students funding for fees if they're not able to take care of themselves, if they've got empty stomachs, if they're very hungry? So the great thing about NSFAS is it's a whole package. It does cover all those other things. But it's not sustainable. And one then has to look at the fact that NSFAS is in many ways a social grant more than an educational grant, because only a very small portion of the NSFAS funding comes back to the university in the form of fees. And the rest, the students get to use to sustain themselves. Given the dire economic situation that we are living in, for many of those students, the amount of money that's allocated to them to live in a decent accommodation with electricity, with Wi-Fi and so on, actually ends up being the amount of money that they use to support their entire family. Because the amount of money students get on NSFAS is far greater than the average unemployed South African gets on a SASSA grant.
I mean, you've touched there on a really sobering point, the reality of conditions facing students in the country and their dependency on NSFAS beyond just sorting themselves out for their studies and things. So as we close, what is the fix then that won't prejudice students who clearly need this funding, but in a way that everything is managed, still make sure that the university gets those necessary investments so that students can still have access to high quality education?
I mean, I think the one thing is that we really have to look at the amount of GDP that is spent on higher education, which is still nowhere close, and research and development generally, which is still nowhere close to what it should be if you look at our National Development Plan and where we see the important parts of society being. So the one thing would obviously be to increase that. The other, I think, is to relook at how NSFAS is being run. I would take it back from the sort of outsourcing, and I would put it back in the universities, which is where it worked much better previously, and we didn't have as much money going missing. And I would look very carefully at putting some of that funding into a social grant budget rather than seeing this as an education budget, whereas it's actually supporting people's lives. So it's a complex issue. It's a simple solution.
And we have seen historically complex. You've been writing about this for years, and I notice a trend. A lot of things that you've been writing about for many, many months are still issues that we're grappling with today. One hopes that there are these conversations that happen that do fundamentally change or reorient the way both funding and student grants work in the benefit of students and higher education institutions. Thanks for your time. Rhodes University Centre for Postgraduate Studies, Professor Sioux McKenna.